it's the mess of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's not the mess of the Navajo Nation. There's somewhere there is a project listing that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has, whether it's at the agency office or at Albuquerque. Whoever's taking care of it, what is their list, that project list across the Navajo Nation? Because you have projects like the buildings in Theru. You have projects such as here, Tuba City. You have Shiprock, which you guys identified fund.
Time, Speaker So. Superintendent, you can provide your response, and then also with the closing, we don't have any more colleagues in the queue. Goshin.
Thank you, Speaker, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Delegate So, yes, thank you very much for that clarification. And I will have our regional, appropriate regional office respond to you with a written response to you. We'll work on that. But we understand your concern. It's a little bit of a complicated issue. As you recall, we had some conversations on that. I remember when I was the acting regional director. So we'll have to look at that also. Thank you, sir. Right now, I guess I can't get this. I guess I can't. Tiut khadeit sito abayadelhi ani sahasyo yo ya da bitsilon down tlanale awat enden hiten naba itia yisen led hona ade hona mazi da bagani eba de tindo bayadelhi ako ayise ha to ye ko da Washington bandel na shi o you the net and legal ni kana chahota lawa respect hazini but I need lump nachi ti de attend edo da the bernal sauce edo da ti de kita kindas na lata khalet as eta to ni no e ba yata ti aron da ti chin ti na nish bel ini e de ta at appetite na lo at as at panda anshi Ede Nikikodo BIA will Yahid out bandage in the shorter. I could declare I is by Haines and Grund I don't kid us aunt although someone but skill now lot us in a share even natched up and city case up and natchishi not anjo not sauce because no nature in the deal. I don't that in Nasco without tea has any as aunt has any. The nap Washington, so the quick shini can't chahot is all our edition. So the Richard Piquet HPD da le RMPA work that all yeah. And John God needs to have now Ada Jodi now for next AD behas on with also Lata Noya that has now Aben Nachi with all because he cow or in the BOM da between days nish. The quick shape at scale has unhalens a legend to the teen at another enido, it has uncle's own 80 low bandit, Arden the Kaya cho any Bacana and Kadida, Arden the Hailan also cho enido, the national sauce being now beat out by yet either, a by yet hido bandit in the short. Aron the Christian Hekudo, Washington, but they need Nishi, the as at a not only than long, get a these in so, opposite days in the show, but not you who don't die other days. So that you say, here, I could not make a go being distance on the snow. I use by Hanson. Yeah.
Yeah, Superintendent Lester Sosi on Zadon Gilwin Echo. Colleagues, we don't have anybody else in queue, and we do not have any more reserved time. At this time, we'll ask to call for a vote on the report. We do have a motion by Vice Chair Johnson that was seconded by Delegate Tolt. Staff, could you help us get the voting board on the screen here? And for the record, we have 2 excused absences. Delegate Curtis Yanito, and Speaker Seth Damon. One more minute on the board. Thank you, colleagues. I believe we gathered all the votes here within the floor. With that, we have a vote of 20 in favor, 0 opposed, with Speaker not voting on the report. Thank you, Superintendent Sosi Yahet. Colleagues, we're going to move down with our agenda. We have Nesnagone old business none. 11 new business. We do have the consent agenda. That was a long report, so colleagues and gallery, feel free to stand and stretch before we go into our set of legislations this afternoon. I know, I'm taking a break. Oh, okay. Thank you, colleagues. We're going down. We have Delegate Tolt. We'll open up the floor for you.
Madam Speaker, thank you. Aron request to out of this consent agenda, my legislation 150 to be off the consent. I have some amendment to do on this one. I would appreciate from the floor to support me before we get into consent. So requesting to take 150-23 off the consent, and at that time I'll make amendments to this legislation. Thank you. Be glad.
Delegate Tolt, just for clarification, did we have on the floor a motion by Delegate Tolt to amend the agenda to exclude legislation 0150-23 from the consent agenda? Colleagues, just for the record, in our rules of order, Rule 6D, it says, once an agenda is adopted by the council, it shall not be revised unless amended by a 2/3 vote. That is of the full council. Well, Delegate Tolt, just for information, will need 16 votes. Second by Delegate Crotty. Colleagues, are there any question on the motion that is currently on the floor? It is right here on the board as well. Or any objections? Going once? Going twice? Going 3 times. We'll go into the vote. This is on the motion that's currently on the floor. Motion to amend the agenda, remove legislation 0150-23 from the consent agenda. We have 50 seconds on the board. Delegate Simpson votes green. Colleagues, we gathered all the votes on the floor. We do have an excused absence for Delegate Curtis Yanito and Speaker Seth Damon. We have a vote of 21 in favor with Speaker not voting. That motion carries forward. That legislation 0150-23 will be the new business letter O after the 2/3 legislations. Colleagues, we will move on with our agenda. New business, we are on consent agenda. Staff, could you help us read those legislations into the record?
Consent agenda, legislation 0120-23, an action relating to the Navajo Committee and the Navajo Nation Council, amending CAP-12-23, the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund Region Project Plan for Honorable Norman M. Begay's Delegate Region. Chapters include Alamo, Rama, Tuajili, to include additional projects for this delegate region. This requires a 2/3 vote of the Navajo Nation Council. Navajo Nation Council is the final authority. This legislation has been read into the record by electronic voice recording per Navajo Nation Council Rules of Order Number 9. This legislation is sponsored by Honorable Norman M. Begay. Legislation 0122-23, an action relating to the Navajo Committee and Navajo Nation Council, amending CAP-21-23, the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund Delegate Region Project Plan for Honorable Herman M. Daniel Jr.'s Delegate Region. Chapters include Sebekin, Navajo Mountain, Shanto, Oljeto, to include additional projects for this delegate region. This legislation is sponsored by Honorable Herman M. Daniels Jr. Co-sponsor is Honorable Seth Damon. This legislation requires a 2/3 vote of the Navajo Nation Council. Navajo Nation Council is final authority. and this legislation has been read into the record by electronic voice recording per Navajo Nation Council Rules of Order Number 9. Legislation 0126-23, an action relating to the Nabagiatik Committee and Navajo Nation Council, approving the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund Delegate Region Project Plan for Honorable Seth Damon's Delegate Region. Chapters include Bahalin, Chechilta, Manuelito, Red Rock, Rock Springs, and Tayato. This legislation sponsored by Honorable Seth Damon, co-sponsored by Honorable Helena Nez-Begay, co-sponsored by Honorable Shundeen Parrish. This legislation requires a 2/3 vote from the Navajo Nation Council. Navajo Nation Council is final authority. This legislation has been read into the record by electronic voice recording per Navajo Nation Council Rules of Order Number 9. Legislation 0127-23, an action relating to the Nabagiatik Committee and Navajo Nation Council, amending CAP-20-23, the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund Delegate Region Project Plan for Honorable Nathan Nota's Delegate Region. Chapters include Coyote Canyon, Mexican Springs, Noshchity, Tohatchee, Bahasla, to include additional projects for this delegate region. This legislation sponsored by Honorable Nathan Nota. This legislation requires 2/3 votes from the Navajo Nation Council. Navajo Nation Council is final authority, and this legislation has been read into the record by electronic voice recording per Navajo Nation Council Rules of Order Number 9. Legislation 0140-23, an action relating to the Nabagiatik Committee and Navajo Nation Council, amending CMY-41-23, the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund Delegate Region Project Plan for Honorable Lamardo Asseret's Delegate Region. Chapters include Klagato, Wide Ruins, Halk, Lupton, Nahat Utzil, to include additional projects for this delegate region. This legislation is sponsored by Honorable Lamardo Asseret. This legislation requires a 2/3 vote of the Navajo Nation Council. Navajo Nation Council is final authority, and this legislation has been read into the record by electronic voice recording per Navajo Nation Council Rules of Order Number 9. Legislation 0148-23, an action relating to the Nabagiatik Committee and Navajo Nation Council, amending CAP-19-23 and CD-68-22, the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund Delegate Region Project Plan for Honorable Andy Nez, PhD's Delegate Region. Chapters include Crystal, Fort Defiance, Red Lake, Sawmill, to include additional projects for this delegate region. This legislation is sponsored by Honorable Andy Nez. This legislation requires a 2/3 vote by the Navajo Nation Council. Navajo Nation Council is final authority, and this legislation has been read into the record by electronic voice recording per Navajo Nation Council Rules of Order Number 9. Legislation 0149-23, an action relating to the Nabagiatik Committee and Navajo Nation Council, amending CD-69-22 and the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund Delegate Region Project Plan for Honorable Sherilyn Yazie's Delegate Region. Chapters include Dalcon, Indian Wells, Tisto, White Cone, Greasewood Springs. This legislation is sponsored by Honorable Sherilyn Yazie. This legislation requires a 2/3 vote of the Navajo Nation Council. Navajo Nation Council is final authority. This legislation has been read into the record by electronic voice recording per Navajo Nation Council Rules of Order Number 9. Legislation